The fastest way to lose an avoidant is to ask them for what you want. Avoidants don't respond to requests the way secure or anxious people do, because their nervous system is calibrated around one core priority: self protection through autonomy. To them, autonomy isn't a preference, it's a survival strategy. It's the internal rule that says, I stay safe by staying unbound. So when you ask directly for closeness, reassurance, commitment, or clarity, it doesn't land as honesty or vulnerability. It lands as pressure, and pressure to an avoidant nervous system feels indistinguishable from being cornered. A request activates something much deeper than the words being spoken. It activates a calculation. What will this cost me? What will I lose if I say yes? How much of myself will I have to give up? Even reasonable requests trigger an internal alarm because they imply expectation. An expectation feels like a tether. Once a tether appears, the avoidance instinct isn't to negotiate, it's to pull away and restore internal space. This is why so many people feel confused with avoidance. You're not asking for too much in reality, you're asking for too much in their perception. Their system doesn't distinguish between a small emotional ask and a lifelong obligation. Both register as the same threat: loss of freedom. So when you ask directly, their nervous system doesn't hear desire or connection. It hears obligation, responsibility, and a future where they are no longer self-contained. The counterintuitive truth is this: avoidants give most freely when nothing is being asked of them. The moment you remove demand from the environment, their nervous system begins to relax. And relaxation is the gateway to desire. When they don't feel managed, measured, or emotionally pulled on, they regain their sense of choice. And choice is everything to an avoidant. Without choice, they shut down. With choice, they re-engage. Stopping asking doesn't mean suppressing your needs or pretending you don't want anything. It means you stop placing your wants in their hands as a requirement for your emotional stability. You don't outsource your peace to their response. You hold your desire quietly, without urgency, without emotional leverage. This changes the entire dynamic. The absence of pressure creates space, and space is where avoidance can finally feel instead of defend. When demand disappears, something subtle but powerful happens. The avoidant begins to approach, not because they're being pulled, but because they're no longer being pushed. They don't feel chased. They don't feel evaluated. They feel unthreatened. In that unthreatened state, curiosity replaces resistance. Voluntary movement replaces avoidance. This is the first and most important rule. You don't get more from an avoidant by asking louder, explaining better, or waiting longer. You get more by becoming emotionally self-anchored and removing the sense that closeness is required. When nothing is demanded, everything becomes possible. Avoidants only say yes when they're allowed to say no. An avoidant will never move toward anything that feels like a trap, even if that thing is connection, love, or you. Their nervous system is constantly scanning for exits, not because they don't care, but because care historically came with cost. To them, being needed often meant being consumed, controlled, or emotionally overwhelmed. So when they sense that a yes might eliminate their ability to say no later, they instinctively freeze or pull away. This is why avoidants resist direct invitations that feel loaded. An invitation that carries emotional weight. I need this from you. This means a lot to me. Please don't say no. Doesn't feel like an opportunity. It feels like a contract. Contracts imply permanence, obligation, and loss of flexibility. Their system reacts by restoring distance, not because they've decided against you, but because they've decided for safety. The paradox is that avoidants only move forward when refusal is genuinely safe. When you communicate energetically and behaviorally, I'll be okay either way, something profound happens inside them. The pressure dissolves, the invisible emotional countdown disappears. They no longer feel responsible for your emotional outcome. And when that responsibility lifts, their nervous system finally has room to breathe. Safety isn't created through reassurance or explanation. It's created through congruence. When your words say, it's okay if you don't, but your behavior says, I'll fall apart if you don't, the avoidant feels the discrepancy immediately. Their system is highly attuned to emotional subtext. True safety is when your stability doesn't change based on their choice. That's when they believe you. Once refusal is safe, choice reappears, and choice is the birthplace of desire. Without choice, any yes feels forced. With choice, a yes becomes an expression of self, not a sacrifice. This is why avoidants often surprise people by offering closeness only after pressure is removed. It isn't manipulation, it's regulation. Their system finally shifts from defense into curiosity. Curiosity replaces resistance when there's nothing to defend against. They begin to wonder instead of withdraw. What would it be like if I leaned in? What if this didn't cost me myself? These questions never arise in an environment of demand. They only emerge in an atmosphere of emotional freedom. Making it safe to say no also means you stop negotiating for connection. You don't over-justify. You don't plead. You don't linger in the doorway waiting for permission. You extend an invitation and then continue living your life emotionally intact. This communicates something powerful. Connection with you is optional, not obligatory. An optional connection feels safe to an avoidant nervous system. This is where desire actually begins, not in persuasion, not in effort, not in sacrifice, but in freedom. When they realize they can choose you without losing themselves, their system no longer needs to protect them from you. And when protection is no longer necessary, attraction has space to grow. If you have to chase it, an avoidant will never give it. Chasing is not neutral to an avoidant nervous system. It isn't interpreted as interest, affection, or commitment. It's interpreted as pressure disguised as pursuit. Every follow-up message, every attempt to close the gap, every effort to pull them closer confirms their deepest fear, that closeness costs freedom. And once that belief is activated, their system does exactly what it's designed to do. It creates distance to regain control. Avoidance, regulate through space. When emotional proximity increases too quickly, they don't lean in to stabilize the bond. They lean out to stabilize themselves. So the more you pursue, the more they feel the need to escape. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because your movement toward them activates their movement away from you. It becomes a reflex, not a decision. This is where most people get trapped. They sense the distance, panic, and pursue harder. They explain more, they reach out more. They try to prove safety through effort, but to an avoidant, increased effort doesn't feel reassuring. It feels invasive. It signals that closeness is being enforced rather than chosen, and anything enforced triggers resistance. The truth is simple but uncomfortable. Anything that must be chased cannot be freely given. Avoidance will only offer what they feel they are choosing on their own terms. The moment they feel followed, monitored, or emotionally tracked, their autonomy feels threatened, and autonomy to them is non-negotiable. The shift happens when you stop moving toward them and start moving forward with your life. This doesn't mean disappearing to provoke a reaction. It means reorienting your energy back to yourself, your routines, your goals, your emotional grounding. When your focus is no longer locked on their response, the emotional pressure lifts, the environment changes. Suddenly, they don't feel hunted. They don't feel like the center of your emotional universe. They feel optional, and optional is not threatening. Optional means they can approach without being consumed. Optional means they can engage without losing themselves. For an avoidant, that's deeply attractive. When you stop chasing, you remove the need for them to run. Space is no longer something they have to create. It already exists. And in that space, something unexpected happens. They begin to notice the gap you're no longer trying to close. They feel your absence not as abandonment, but as freedom paired with loss. This is the paradox avoidants live inside. They crave connection, but only when it doesn't cost autonomy. By not chasing, you signal emotional self-sufficiency. You show that connection with you enhances life rather than replaces it. That's when curiosity can return. Why aren't they pulling? Why do I suddenly feel the distance? Chasing creates imbalance. Forward movement creates gravity. When you move forward with your life, you stop proving your value and start embodying it. And avoidants don't move toward people who chase them. They move toward people who are grounded enough to let them come freely. Avoidants don't attach to people, they attach to relief. Avoidants are not pulled toward intensity. In the way many people assume, grand gestures, emotional deep dives, and future-focused conversations don't create safety for them. They create activation. Their nervous system has learned that heightened emotion precedes loss of control, expectation, or enmeshment. So while intensity may feel like connection to others, to an avoidant, it feels like a warning signal. What they are drawn to instead is relief. Relief is the absence of emotional demand. Relief is being able to exhale without needing to perform, explain, or manage someone else's feelings. Relief is rare for them because many of their relationships have required emotional labor. They didn't know how to give without losing themselves. So when they encounter someone who doesn't escalate, doesn't push, and doesn't pull on them for reassurance, their system registers something unfamiliar: calm. This is why avoidants often feel closer to people who seem emotionally steady and self-contained. When you are regulated, when your mood, worth, and sense of self don't fluctuate based on their behavior, you become a stabilizing presence. Not because you're distant, but because you're grounded. Your calm tells their nervous system, nothing bad happens here, and safety for an avoidant is far more compelling than passion. Being the place they breathe doesn't mean suppressing emotion or becoming cold. It means you don't leak anxiety into the connection. You don't use emotional conversations as a way to anchor them. You don't rush to define or solidify what's happening. You allow space for connection to unfold without urgency. This creates an environment where they can show up without fear of being overwhelmed. When you are calm and emotionally regulated, they begin to associate you with peace. Your presence doesn't spike their cortisol, it lowers it. And that shift is powerful. Their body starts to crave the state they experience around you, even if they can't consciously explain why. They may not call it love, they may not articulate attachment, but they will keep returning to the experience of being with you because it feels different from everything else. Peace is rare for avoidance because many have lived in a constant state of internal vigilance. They learned early that closeness came with unpredictability. So when they encounter someone whose presence doesn't demand more than they can give, their defenses soften. Not all at once, not dramatically, but subtly, over time. This is also why avoidants often pull away after emotionally intense moments. Intensity disrupts their sense of internal order. Relief restores it. If you want to remain someone they gravitate toward, you become the person who doesn't amplify emotional chaos. You become consistent, grounded, and steady. They may not chase the feeling, they may not romanticize it, but their nervous system remembers where it felt safe to breathe, and that memory draws them back. Avoidants don't bond through fireworks. They bond through the quiet realization that being with you feels easier than being alone. The moment they feel they owe you, they pull away. Avoidants don't retreat from connection itself. They retreat from connection that comes with a bill. The instant closeness feels transactional. Their nervous system interprets it as danger. Not because they're selfish or uncaring, but emotional debt threatens their autonomy. Owing someone means being tethered. Being tethered means losing freedom, and losing freedom to an avoidant feels like losing safety. Emotional debt doesn't have to be spoken to be felt. It lives in tone, timing, and expectation. It shows up as I showed up for you, so you should show up for me, or after everything I've done, you owe me clarity. Even when these words are never said out loud, avoidants sense the imbalance instantly. Their system is finely tuned to detect obligation. The moment giving feels like a ledger instead of a choice, they begin to withdraw. This is why avoidants often pull away after moments of deep support. You were there for them during a hard time, listened, showed up, held space, and then suddenly they go quiet. To you, it feels confusing and painful. To them, it feels like the moment the invisible bill arrived. Their system starts bracing for repayment. They don't know how to make without overextending themselves. Avoidants struggle with the idea of emotional reciprocity when it feels measured or timed. They don't want to be counted on in a way that feels compulsory. So when connection starts to feel like exchange instead of experience, they instinctively create distance to reset the balance. Distance is how they erase debt. When you give without collecting, something powerful happens. When your care isn't followed by expectation, pressure, or subtle reminders, the avoidance nervous system relaxes. They don't feel trapped, they don't feel cornered, they feel trusted, and trust is the one currency that actually matters to them. Giving without collecting doesn't mean self-abandonment. It means you're not using your generosity as leverage. You're not keeping score, you're not emotionally investing in hopes of a specific return. Your support is clean, and a clean support feels safe. Safe support allows them to stay present instead of disappearing. When avoidants feel trusted, they're far more likely to give back, not out of obligation, but out of choice. This is voluntary reciprocity. It happens slowly, unevenly, and often quietly, but it's real, and it only emerges when they don't feel indebted. The irony is that the less you ask for repayment, the more they're willing to offer on their own terms. They notice your value when you stop filling the silence. Avoidants don't miss people during closeness. When you're present, available, responsive, and emotionally attuned, they often take that stability for granted. Not intentionally, but neurologically. Their system is busy regulating closeness, not appreciating it. It's only when that closeness is removed that awareness sets in. But absence only works when it's clean, not dramatic, not punishing, not resentful, not designed to provoke guilt, just gone. Clean absence is the absence that doesn't explain itself. It doesn't announce its exit. It doesn't linger in the doorway hoping to be noticed. It simply stops overfunctioning. It stops initiating, soothing, checking in, and emotionally managing the connection. And in doing so, it creates a gap. For most of the relationship, you were filling that gap without realizing it. You carried the emotional continuity, you maintained the rhythm, you bridged silences. You made things easy. Avoidants are comfortable receiving this kind of invisible labor because it keeps connection present without requiring them to stretch beyond their limits. When you stop filling the silence, they finally feel what you were carrying. At first, they may feel relief. Space feels familiar. Autonomy returns. But then something else happens. The environment feels quieter, less warm, less connected. And because your absence isn't hostile or demanding, their system doesn't activate defenses. Instead, it begins to register loss. This is when absence becomes information. They start to notice the emotional texture that's missing, the way conversations flowed more easily, the sense of grounding they felt around you, the subtle regulation your presence provided. They don't miss you because you beg to be missed. They miss you because the system finally has room to notice the difference. This is the only kind of missing that works with avoidance. It isn't fueled by fear or panic. It's fueled by contrast, and contrast requires restraint. If absence is laced with resentment or punishment, the avoidant reads it as manipulation and detaches further. But when absence is neutral, self-directed, and grounded, it invites reflection. By stepping back without drama, you send a powerful message. I'm not here to manage this alone. You stop compensating for the imbalance. You allow the natural consequences of your absence to be felt. And because avoidants are highly sensitive to shifts in emotional environment, they eventually notice. They may not rush back. They may not articulate what they're feeling. But internally, the gap does its work. It teaches them what your presence actually provided, and that awareness cannot be forced. It can only be discovered. When you stop overfunctioning, you stop carrying the relationship on your nervous system alone. And in that space, avoidants finally have the opportunity to step forward, not because they were chased, pressured, or reminded, but because they felt the quiet truth of what was lost. If you explain your worth, you've already lost it. Avoidants don't move toward logic, arguments, or explanations. They move toward felt experience. This is where many people misstep when an avoidant pulls back. The instinct is to clarify, to reason, to explain why the connection matters, why it's safe, why you're different. But to an avoidant nervous system, convincing doesn't sound like care. It sounds like persuasion. And persuasion sounds like control. The moment you start explaining your value, you place yourself in a position of needing agreement. You turn connection into a debate. You imply that their understanding is required for your worth to be valid. Avoidance sense this immediately. Their system registers it as pressure, not because your words are wrong, but because the act of convincing suggests that something must be accepted, acknowledged, or decided. Avoidants are highly resistant to being led emotionally. They don't want to be talked into closeness. They want to arrive there on their own. When you try to convince them, you remove their sense of authorship. And without authorship, they disengage. Even the most logical, compassionate explanation can trigger withdrawal if it feels like it's steering them toward a conclusion they didn't choose. This is why avoidants often seem unmoved by heartfelt conversations. It's not that they don't hear you, It's that emotional persuasion bypasses their sense of safety. Their nervous system isn't asking, does this make sense? It's asking, am I being pushed? And if the answer is yes, even subtly, they pull back. Instead of convincing, you let your life demonstrate. You embody stability. Your emotions don't swing wildly based on their availability. You maintain boundaries without anger or apology. You don't overextend to secure closeness. You don't chase validation. Your self-respect is visible in how you move, choose, and respond. Self-respect is the one thing avoidance can't ignore because it signals safety without pressure. It says, I'm not here to collapse into you, and I'm not here to control you. This is deeply regulating for their nervous system. It removes the fear that closeness will require them to manage your emotions or define your worth. When you stop convincing, something shifts. The avoidant is no longer reacting to your explanations. They're reacting to your presence. They observe how you handle distance, how you respond to uncertainty, how you hold yourself when things aren't being defined. This lived experience speaks louder than any conversation ever could. Avoidants don't trust words easily. They trust patterns. And when your pattern is grounded, consistent, and self-directed, their system begins to relax. You're no longer someone they need to resist. You become someone they can approach without losing autonomy. That's when movement happens, not because you argued your case, but because your way of being made sense to their body. You can want something without chasing it. This is the paradox that disarms avoidance. Most people believe desire must be acted on, expressed, or pursued to be real, but avoidants experience desire differently. When desire comes wrapped in urgency or dependency, their nervous system interprets it as a threat. When desire exists without demand, it feels safe. Holding desire without needing it means you're clear about what you want, but your sense of self doesn't hinge on whether you get it. You're honest but not attached, open but not leaning. This distinction is subtle, but avoidants feel it immediately. It tells their system, connection here won't cost you your freedom. Needing your desire met creates pressure even when nothing is said. It shows up in tone, timing, and emotional posture. It's the unspoken hope that their response will stabilize you. Avoidants are highly sensitive to this energy. When they feel it, they instinctively create space. Not to punish you, but to protect themselves. When you hold desire without needing, you remove the emotional weight from the connection. You're not waiting for permission to be okay. You're not measuring your worth by their response. You're allowing the desire to exist without turning it into a requirement. This creates a rare environment for avoidance, one where closeness is optional, not obligatory. This doesn't mean you suppress your wants or pretend you don't care. It means you don't collapse into the wanting. You don't overinvest. You don't chase outcomes. You let desire be present without demanding resolution. And in that space, something unexpected happens. The avoidance system softens. Without urgency pressing against them, they can actually feel their own desire. They're no longer reacting to yours. They're responding to theirs. This is critical. Avoidance will only move toward what feels internally generated. When they sense that connection is being offered, not required, they regain agency. Agency is the gateway to intimacy for avoidance. When they feel free to choose, they're far more likely to engage. And often they offer what you never demanded, not because you withheld strategically, but because your non-attachment made it safe for them to step forward. This is the quiet power of holding desire without needing it met. It communicates confidence, emotional maturity, and self-trust. And to an avoidant nervous system, that combination feels like freedom, not abandonment, not pressure, but an open door they can walk through on their own. Avoidants only value what they think was their idea. Avoidants do not respond to being led, guided, or emotionally steered toward a conclusion. Even gentle direction can feel intrusive to a nervous system that equates autonomy with safety. The moment they sense they are being nudged toward a realization, decision, or emotional outcome, their defenses rise. not because the outcome is wrong, but because the process feels like a loss of authorship. For avoidance, authorship is everything. They need to feel that their choices emerge from within, not from influence or persuasion. This is why they often resist advice, labels, and relationship conversations that aim to define what something is or where it's going. Definition feels like finality. Finality feels like a door closing. And avoidants always need to know they can leave. They don't respond to being led. They respond to discovering. Discovery preserves autonomy. It allows them to move at their own pace, integrate feelings privately, and arrive at insight without pressure. When you stop directing the narrative, stop explaining what they feel, what this means, or what should happen next, you create space for reflection. And reflection is where avoidants actually process attachment. This is why silence can be more powerful than conversation. When you stop filling the space with interpretation or instruction, their mind begins to work. They replay moments. They notice shifts. They ask themselves questions they would never answer out loud. Why did that feel different? Why do I miss them now? Why does the space feel heavier than expected? What they discover on their own feels safer than anything you could ask for because it doesn't threaten their independence. It doesn't require them to defend, explain, or commit prematurely. It simply is. And self-generated insight is far more durable than anything imposed from the outside. Letting them come to their own conclusion also means releasing the need to be understood in the moment. Avoidants often understand later, in hindsight, in quiet, when the emotional environment is calm enough for their system to lower its guard. If you push for clarity before their system is ready, you only reinforce avoidance. This doesn't mean waiting passively or tolerating ambiguity forever. It means recognizing timing. It means trusting that what's real will surface without coercion. When you stop trying to manage their awareness, you give their nervous system permission to feel without resistance. And when they do arrive at their own conclusion, whether about you, the connection, or their feelings, it carries weight. It feels owned, chosen, safe. That's the only kind of conclusion an avoidant can truly stand behind. You don't get what you want from avoidance by wanting less, you get it by needing less. This is the truth that reframes everything. This approach isn't manipulation, it's not strategy, it's nervous system alignment, it's understanding how avoidant attachment actually works and meeting it without self-abandonment or control. Wanting less would mean suppressing your needs, shrinking your desires, and convincing yourself you don't care. That's not the answer. Avoidants don't respond to self-erasure, they respond to self-possession. The shift happens when you need less. Not because your desires disappeared, but because your sense of self no longer depends on their fulfillment. Needing less means you are emotionally whole without them. Your stability doesn't hinge on their availability. Your worth isn't negotiated through their choices. You can desire connection without being destabilized by its absence. This is deeply regulating to an avoidant nervous system because it removes the fear that closeness will come with emotional responsibility they can't carry. When you are whole without them, they feel free with you. Freedom is the missing ingredient in most avoidant dynamics, not distance, not detachment. Freedom, the sense that connection doesn't require self-sacrifice or emotional labor beyond their capacity. This is why avoidance often feels safest with people who don't need to be chosen to feel okay. Your independence isn't a threat, it's an invitation. It tells them I'm here because I want to be, not because I need you to make me whole. And that distinction changes everything. Freedom is the doorway through which avoidants finally choose connection. Not because they were convinced, chased, or pressured, but because the environment allowed their nervous system to relax enough to want closeness. Choice replaces defense. Curiosity replaces fear. Desire replaces obligation. The paradox is that the more you anchor into yourself, the less the relationship becomes about getting something from them, and the more likely they are to offer it. Not on demand, not on a timeline, but free. And that's the only kind of connection avoidance can sustain.